Eberhard, or I should say good afternoon, or I know you are not in India anymore, so now you are in France, back from India. First of all, thank you very much for having accepted this interview. So you are a law anthropologist and more specifically a guest researcher and professor in anthropology and theory of the law at the University of Saint-Louis in Brussels. You are also a guest professor at the European Academy of Law Theory in Brussels and member of the Legal Anthropology Laboratory of Paris. The first point I would like to discuss with you today is about the conciliation between the two fields in which you are working in. In fact, as you said in the preface of one of your books, Human Rights and Intercultural Dialogue, when you started your research for your thesis about human rights and the diversity of cultures, it was not easy to defend it and quite taboo. Some people were even asking you if you were supporting torture in the name of culture, for example. How did you prove the critics wrong?
And maybe the first thing which is important to keep in mind always is the context where you're doing things. So I was writing my thesis in France, which maybe in Europe is the most, let's say, universalistic country. It's maybe the country in Europe which has most problems with the recognition of cultural diversity or communities, so which is very much linked to the French world vision of la République, the republic, and the unicité de la République, the unity of the republic. So you don't have the same kind of thing in Belgium, where already you have different linguistic communities. You don't have the same thing in Austria. I'm Austrian, basically. But we even have, it's a small country, but we have 9 federal states. So just to say that we should not forget about this context. So in France, indeed, so beginning of the 1990s, when I started to work on this question of human rights and intercultural dialogue, it was very difficult to be able to be heard. Because as soon as you put in the same sentence the idea of human rights and cultures, so human rights would be, I would say, the French self-identification. It's what is rational, what is universal, what is progressive, what is civilized. And if in the same title you would put cultures, the feeling would be that you try to put some communalism, some ghetto of particularisms, some archaic traditions, all that kind of things in. Because the French perception is very much this perception. So that is why, and especially so, that first context is the French context. Second context is that my thesis was a thesis in law. It was not a thesis in anthropology. So of course, if you're in France and if you wrote at that time maybe a research work in anthropology, it would have again been more easy to talk about culture because anthropology is about culture. But law is not about culture. It is about how to organize a society and how to organize it in the French view from the state point of view, from the universalistic point of view. And so because of these two reasons, so the French culture on the one hand and the legal context in which I was doing the work on the other, it was not only difficult to get heard, but actually when you were just mentioning that kind of questions, well, people were very much shocked. So the reactions that I got was, for example, oh, what are you working on? Oh, I work on human rights and cultural diversity, or human rights and cultures, or human rights and intercultural dialogue. And immediately I would have reactions like, oh, so you're for excision, you're for torture, I didn't even say what I'm going to look at or what I'm going to find. Just putting culture and human rights in the same problématique, as we would say in French, immediately triggered some very, very defensive reactions. So at the beginning, this was a bit disconcerting for me because I thought, like, isn't the university supposed to do research, and try to understand things? Also in 1993, so I started to work on these questions in like 94, 95. But in 1993, you had this World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, where for the first time, very loudly actually, there were some critiques on the Western character of human rights. So there were different countries who mentioned or pointed out that, it may be a Western thing and not a universal thing per se. And of course, there were some political reasons for this, but they also pointed some truth. So from that context, I thought, there's a question which is really there. It was even starting to become a global important question, as this conference in Vienna had shown. So for me, at the beginning, I really did not at all understand where the problem came from. Okay. Especially also being Austrian, and being an Austrian not completely sharing maybe the French worldview.
Yes.
So that's I was really unaware. Just said something and it triggered strange reactions. Then little by little, I started to understand that for French people, or you could say more generally speaking, people who do, let's say the word, believe very much in human rights, human rights is not just a rational construct. It is something which is sacred. It's something which you believe in so much as other people would believe in their religions or something. But usually what we say is that we always feel that others believe. You're Hindus, so you believe in Hinduism, or you're Christians, so you believe in Christianism. But when we place ourselves on the side of, for example, human rights or democracy or development or science, then usually we do not assume that we also believe in this. We just feel that is the rational thing. That is the true thing. That is the objective thing to do. And so for me, what was very interesting is little by little to start to understand that actually having a dialogue means to, yes, on the one hand, have a rational debate, very important, and on the other hand, also to understand where people speak from. And also understanding that the point where people speak from may make certain things difficult to say or to be heard. Because let's put it like in a word, in a nutshell, because it's taboo to talk about this.
Yes.
Unthinkable to question certain things. And I must admit, even for myself, before starting to work explicitly on the question of human rights and intercultural dialogue, I never thought that you could actually rethink human rights in a different way. For me, like, human rights was always something which is floating up there, some rules which cannot be touched, which are beyond even the normal law, something like this. And in my laboratory of legal anthropology in l'Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, that I discovered that you actually were able to think about these things. And how did I discover it? Because my professor, Étienne Leroy, had been invited à l'Institut International des Droits de l'Homme à Strasbourg to give courses on the anthropology of human rights. So I tried to see all these questions. Are human rights universal? Are they not universal? Can they be made universal? What is the intercultural dialogue in it, and so on? And so to say that even for me it was a question I never thought about, I didn't even could think about it, but then I didn't have any special block to start thinking about it. And the people that I encountered, I just found out that, it's not only that they had not thought about it, but it was unthinkable for them. Or when you started to do it, it really started to very, very deeply shake their self-understanding of who they are in the world.
Okay.
What proved me right or wrong? What you have to do is when you do any kind of work which is departing from mainstream opinion, to put it like that, you have to be very, very, very thorough in argumenting. If you say human rights are wonderful and France is the country of human rights, in France you don't need to have much proof. Because people will agree with you. At the moment you start to try to say something different, just even mentioning a word already triggers so many reactions that you really have to know why are you using the words that you use. How do you back it up? How do you explain what you're doing? How do you, if I take a legal language, how to build your case? In such a way that on the one hand it can be heard, so you also have to take people little by little and open things up more and more, because, for example, part of the human rights debate, there are cultural rights in the human rights debate. There is an African Charter of Human Rights. So there are certain things in the field of rights which open up already to other cultures. And so the thing was how to little by little, and then there was problems that human rights lawyers or human rights activists were encountering in practice, where they would see the gap which is there between their theories and then the practice, the grassroots practices. And we also had this feeling that, well, it may have something to do with social, cultural conditions that maybe we did not always take into account enough. And so I would say what I tried to do is, on the one hand, to, well, very well argue everything that I was saying, and at the same time to try to have, I would say, pedagogic kind of approach, where I just try to take people little by little from what they know and then open up more and more their field of vision. And of course, there are some people that may want to come along with you, and it's not always easy. I mean, for myself, it was not only intellectual challenges, but I did have in my process of doing my research on intercultural questions, I had existential crises.
Yes.
It's not only like intellectual questions. When you really take these things seriously, there's moments where you do lose your in French repère, you know, your
values,
reference.
Yeah, reference.
And so I can understand very much that not everybody wants to do that. And so you have this defensive reaction, you know, where you say, no, I don't want to go there.
To protect themselves.
Yeah, instead of saying, well, I don't want to go there, obviously the way that you defend yourself is, no, this cannot be done. No, this is stupid. No, this is nonsense. No, this, whatever, you know? You projection in an objective way. So what I tried to do on one hand, so I started this with my first master thesis I wrote in my laboratoire in 95, 96, and then I continued to do it at the European Academy of Legal Theory, is just very patiently and little by little, try to give the tools to people to understand how we could approach that kind of question which may seem non-approachable or non-thinkable. That's on my side. And then I've been doing this for the last almost like 20 years now. I mean, whatever I'm doing, I'm always trying to do that kind of thing. Now, the second thing that happened is that that's not me so much. It's just like the general evolution of the world, if you want. Remember that 1989 was the breaking down of the Iron Curtain, with this division of, I would say, the West and the communist countries, which kind of crumbled. And so what started to happen is that you had more and more this emergence of a, let's say, more pluripolar world. Although you still have what some call the American empire, which is very much present, but you start to have other things which emerge. You had China emerging, India emerging, Brazil. You had other powers starting to emerge. And also, in the last 20 years, they became much, much more powerful. So little by little, maybe from one world which was divided in two worlds, and maybe a third world, we started to enter more and more what I sometimes say we left the universe for a pluriverse, where this idea of globalization became more and more important. And the globalization started to mean understand the global and local relationship. And so that probably helped to make the message audible, because if you go back to the end of the 90s, end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, see all the questions of human rights and intercultural dialogue, it was a very kind of theoretical debate. But this is question universalism versus relativism. Can you be at the same time universalist and relativist? My thing was, maybe you can be more pluralistic. The thing was, is there a possibility to bridge the gap between theories and practices? Yes, maybe. You can have a more pragmatic approach. But at the same time, the whole framework was a very much, let's say, abstract framework. Now, with globalization, what started to happen is little by little, and you find the same thing actually in the general evolution of the social sciences, for example, like in anthropology. Instead of talking so much about what is universal and what is relative in the different cultures, there's a second couple which started to be very much present and gain more and more prominence, which is this global-local. And which is, there are global things and at the same time they interact with the local. So there's terms of the glocal, G-L-O-C-A-L, so the in-between of global and local. So in a certain way, not exactly, but global-local is somehow a bit, it echoes the universalism, relativism debate. Because we have global human rights, but how do you translate the global human rights into local practices? How do you translate local problems into global human rights agendas? And so, because of this shift, what started to happen is, when we talk about global, local, we talk about real lives. We talk about real dynamics. In real life, things may be very complex, but they do not contradict each other. They coexist.
Yes.
So I think that in the since the beginning of the 1990s, there was this trend in research to move more to this global, local approach, which is a more action-based, let's say, kind of approach. And so which in a certain way made it more easy to start to talk about differences, not in a big philosophical debate about can there be unity and difference at the same time, but just by trying to understand what was going on. At the same time, there's another word that became very, very important, and which you also have to keep in mind. So we said globalization is one of them. The other one is governance. Because before, when we thought about law, it was government. It's a state. The state obviously has the monopoly of law. So in all the corporations that, for example, the French state had with its ex-colonies and so on, whenever you were talking about law, you did talk about state law. And whenever you had somebody saying, look, in this or that African context, maybe the state law is only 5% of the real law in a country, you have all these other laws, the living laws, alternative practices of laws, or whatever you may call them, the jurists may listen, but then they will just say, okay, that's nice, but we are not concerned with this because we're talking about law. And your thing is not law. It's not state law, so it's not law. It's whatever you want. It's sociological. But we don't have to deal with this.
Like separated.
It's separated because the state is doing one thing and then the other thing is society. That's something different. Now, what changed with governance is that the big word, which is maybe at the center of governance, is the idea of participation. Participation means that, all the different stakeholders, that's the other word that is used very much, so all the people who have a stake in a problem must somehow be heard. So at the moment you say this, it means we do have to listen. If we want to build a rule of law in, Mali, we do have to listen and to understand what are the things that make sense for people in Mali. What are the logics that they function on? What are the institutions that they may have, even if they are not official institutions? And so you started to put it in a certain way. I'm giving more the positive side of things, okay? We could also criticize. But the positive thing that happened is that maybe from a logic which was more a logic of exclusion, very segmentary logic, state does one thing, economic does one thing, law does one thing, sociology does one thing, and those things do not really interact, we move to an approach which is more, let's say, holistic or interdependent. Now you want to governance or think of sustainable development. What is sustainable development? It's the environment, it's the society, it's the economic, all this together. We have to find the in-betweens. And so I think that, generally speaking, in the last 15, 20 years, what has changed very much is, on the one hand, the world has become more pluripolar. You have these powers which emerge more and more. So little by little, we have to deal more. Go into schools in Belgium or in France, so we can learn Chinese now there. 10 years ago, you couldn't learn Chinese so much. So there is this awareness that we are not anymore the only people around. And at the same time, because of this concept of globalization governance, also an approach which is maybe more focusing on what is really going on processes of what is going on. And so in a certain way, leaving this idea of principle of non-contradiction and of separating things into principle more of complementarity of differences. So I would say that's maybe the things which have changed. And so I'm happy. I'm not saying that I was the one who changed this or whatever, but I'm just happy to see that over the last 10, 20 years, little by little you started to have more and more also other anthropologists starting to work on these questions of human rights, intercultural dialogue, human rights between the global and the local. And actually 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, I was very happy I received the report of the Council of Human Rights Policies in in Geneva, where it made a whole report on human rights and legal pluralism. So, which were things probably like 10 or 15 years ago, it was kind of unthinkable. So
it's an evolution,
and I must say one other thing, because there's also cycles. So now maybe things are opening up a little more. But you should not forget that, like, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually drafted, like in the end of the Second World War, there had been anthropologists who had already been saying that kind of thing. They said, there may be a problem, just like assuming that we have a universal.
From the beginning,
You even had a statement by the American Anthropological Association, who already criticized that kind of things. But then, because of political reasons, because all kinds of things, we didn't listen to that too much, and we were in this idea of progress, development, and the West is progress and development, and we have to be civilized, and so we didn't listen to it so much. Now with the new questions coming up, some space is given to it, and there I would just say like one little sentence, and then we can maybe go to the next point, which just is the problem with it becoming very popular now is that it's become like a fashion, so it's like, so we have to have intercultural dialogue and that will solve all the problems, It's kind of a fashion, it's a trend, and so because it becomes a trend, even people who don't really know about it, when start to talk about it, because that's how maybe you can get some contracts or you can, whatever, it's, so we start doing it, and again, we may start to do it as we want to sell it, now it's a new thing, you have to be logical, you have to be intercultural and so on. And so because you want to sell it, you don't want to focus again on the whole difficulties. It is not that intercultural dialogue is a universal, I don't know how you say that in English, like panacea universelle, panacea, I don't know how you pronounce in English. It's not to say, let's just dialogue and we will all love each other. We have to dialogue, and I think we are more and more confronted to a situation where we want it or not want it. We have to dialogue. At the same time, when you really start to dialogue, it's also painful. And Bert Vachon, whom I like very much, was the director of the Intercultural Institute of Montreal and the director of its journal Intercultural. He always likes to say very much intercultural dialogue is crucifying. And then he adds, but liberating. But very often we only hear the but liberating and we don't hear the crucifying.
The first.
And the question is, how do we, in a context where now it's so wonderful to dialogue, how do we get the idea across? Wonderful, but real dialogue means that I also must listen to other points of view. I must take them seriously. They may challenge me very deeply. So this takes time also, because I cannot understand things by just having read them once or something. That's where the anthropological idea of spending time, for example, in the country that you want to do is very important. And then over the years, little by little, you hear things, you're experiencing things, and sometimes things are in front of your eyes, you don't see them, and then you don't realize them. And then only little by little, you start to realize. And then sometimes you start to realize, and it scares you, so you don't want to let it get nearer to you. So how to accept? So it's not only like an intellectual journey, but it's also a very existential journey. And so I would say what you said at the beginning, so what was the problem and how did I try to get people to change their minds, is maybe I think you really have to respect the fact that we are human beings and we cannot change like this. It's difficult, So it's also I've started to understand that, for example, the kind of work that I'm doing will not appeal to everybody. There will be some lawyers who will not be able to hear me and will maybe not be able to hear me for another 10 or 20 years. At the beginning, I wanted to convince everybody. It was like, we have to get this new awareness or something. And now I just realized, there's some people who are confronted to certain problems, so those people I try to provide a certain number of tools which may help them, doing their own path, to maybe explore and see things in a different light. But at the same time, you also have to respect that there's some people who may not have this sensitivity, who may not be interested. And it is also very necessary, especially in the human rights field, of having some people who are more, let's say, militant, say, no, I don't care about all this, like, cultural bullshit, this is wrong, and that's why I criticize it. It's very important that you have these people also. So the last point I want to bring is that when you try to enter more like dialogue approach, yeah, what I'm trying to share is this sensitivity of dialogue, which does not mean that I'm necessarily not agreeing also at the same time with some people. Sometimes I have not a very dialogical approach, but where I think if we only had the dialogical approach, sometimes it's very difficult, because it takes so much time, and then you find yourself in a situation where you cannot act on certain things,
Yes.
But I'm like, also this should be kept in mind.
Okay, thank you.